The sun over the Arizona territory was a hammer, and the land was its anvil. For 3 days, Eli Monroe had felt it beat down on him, forging his solitude into something harder, sharper. Dust, the color of rust and bone, coated his clothes, his horse, and the back of his throat. It was a taste he knew well. The world, he had long ago decided, was mostly dust and silence, and he preferred it that way. He rode with his hat pulled low, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon where the distant Dragoon Mountains clawed at a pale, merciless sky. Behind him, a small herd of longhorns, 20 head in all, kicked up their own slow-moving cloud. They were the last of his stock, the final ties to a life he was methodically erasing. He was heading for Bisbee, a mining town carved into the side of a canyon, a place known for swallowing men whole. It was a good place to sell cattle, collect his money, and become a ghost again. A good place to be forgotten. Eli did not seek trouble, but he had a way of finding it, or perhaps it had a way of finding him. It came to him on the 3rd day, not as the crack of a rifle or the challenge of another rider, but as a small sound, thin and weak, almost lost in the ceaseless wind. He reined in his buckskin. The creak of old leather a loud complaint in the quiet. He listened. It came again, a whimper from the base of a cluster of red rock cliffs that jutted from the desert floor like broken teeth. He swung down from his horse, his movements economical, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. He moved toward the rocks, his boots making no sound in the soft sand. Tucked into a sliver of shade was a child, an Apache child. He reckoned from the simple cotton shirt and breechcloth, no more than 6 or 7 summers old. The boy's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone a pale splinter jutting through the skin. His face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, his dark eyes wide with a fear so pure it bordered on stillness. He had been left to the sun, the coyotes, or the patrols that rode this land with a cold and casual cruelty. Eli saw the shadow of a government patrol's dust trail miles to the east. Helping this child was a risk. It was an invitation for questions he had no intention of answering. It was an entanglement, and Eli Monroe avoided entanglements the way a sane man avoids a rattlesnake. He looked at the boy's fractured leg, then at the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert around them. He remembered another kind of stillness, another pair of eyes clouded with pain. He knelt. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The boy flinched, trying to drag himself backward, a fresh wave of agony washing over his face. Eli moved slowly, showing his empty hands. He took out his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and offered it. The boy stared, suspicious, his small chest heaving. Eli set the canteen down on the ground, just within reach, and backed away a few steps. After a long moment, the boy's hand snaked out, snatching the canteen and drinking in ragged, desperate gulps. Eli went back to his horse and returned with a strip of jerky and his medical pouch, a small leather roll containing little more than carbolic acid, clean rags, and a bottle of laudanum. He worked with a quiet competence, cleaning the wound as best he could while the boy trembled. His teeth clenched against the pain. He did not have the skill to set the bone properly, but he could bind it, keep it from shifting. He fashioned a crude splint from a broken branch of mesquite and strips of his own bedroll. He gave the boy a single drop of laudanum on a piece of the jerky, just enough to dull the edge of the hurt. Throughout it all, he did not speak much. Words were complicated things. They built bridges and burned them. Actions were simpler. He lifted the boy, who was light as a bundle of dry sticks, and carried him to the horse. Getting them both mounted was a clumsy affair, but soon they were moving, Eli steering them west, away from the patrol's likely path. He knew of a small, hidden settlement nestled in the foothills, a place where the boy's people sometimes made camp. It was half a day's ride out of his way. The cattle would have to wait. He found the camp just as the sun began to bleed across the western sky. A few figures emerged from the wickiups, their faces hard and wary. Eli rode in slowly, holding the child in front of him. An old woman with a face like a dried apple stepped forward, her eyes locking on the boy's splinted leg. She let out a soft cry and rushed to the horse's side. Eli dismounted and gently handed the boy down into her waiting arms. She clutched the child to her chest, murmuring to him in a language Eli did not understand, but whose meaning was as clear as water. Others gathered around, their initial suspicion melting into a tense, quiet gratitude. No one spoke to Eli. No one offered thanks. He did not expect it. He did not want it. He had done what needed to be done. A simple act of accounts balancing in the great, bloody ledger of the world. He mounted his horse, turned it back toward the trail to Bisbee, and rode away without a backward glance, the dust swallowing him once more. He arrived in Bisbee the next afternoon. The town was a raw gash in the earth, a chaotic jumble of clapboard buildings clinging to the steep sides of Mule Gulch. The air, thick with coal smoke from the copper smelters, was a constant irritant in his lungs. The main thoroughfare, Brewery Gulch, was a river of mud and refuse. Men in sweat-stiffened clothes stumbled in and out of the dozens of saloons that lined the street, their faces grim with the effort of either finding their fortune or drowning their failure. Eli saw the town's cruelty laid bare in the afternoon sun. He saw children with old, hungry eyes begging for scraps outside the mercantile, their small hands held out to men who shoved them aside without a thought. He saw a man, his face bloated with cheap whiskey, strike a woman with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling into the muck. She lay there for a moment, a splash of color from her calico dress against the brown filth, before slowly picking herself up, her expression vacant. Eli's gaze drifted to the town sheriff, a portly man with a drooping mustache, who was leaning against a support pillar of the hotel porch. The sheriff saw the whole thing. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the street and turned his head, suddenly fascinated by the peeling paint on the wall beside him. This was Bisbee, a town without a conscience, a perfect place to disappear. After settling his cattle in a holding pen and arranging their sale for the following day, Eli took a room above the livery stable. It was small, smelled of hay and horse manure, and offered a view of a grimy alley. It suited him just fine. He washed his face in the basin of murky water. The man staring back at him from the cracked mirror, a stranger with tired eyes and a jaw tight with things left unsaid for years. He looked older than his 34 years. The desert and his memories had seen to that. As darkness fell, the town did not sleep. It came alive, its true nature revealed under the flickering gas lamps and the pale, distant stars. The tinny sounds of pianos spilled from every saloon, a frantic, joyless music that seemed to mock the very idea of hope, drawn by a need for a drink and a desire to remain unseen in a crowd. Eli pushed through the swinging doors of the gilded cage. The name was a lie. There was nothing gilded about it. The air was a fog of cigar smoke and stale beer. The floor was covered in sawdust that had long since given up trying to hide the grime beneath. Men crowded around gaming tables, their faces illuminated in the stark lamplight, a mixture of greed, desperation, and fleeting triumph. They were miners, ranchers, drifters, and gamblers, all pieces of the same lonely, grasping whole. Eli found a spot at the far end of the long bar, ordered a whiskey, and leaned back against the wall, a silent observer in a loud and sordid world. And then he saw her. She was on a small, raised stage at the back of the room. A space had been cleared around it, and the men watched her with a raw, possessive hunger. She was beautiful. There was no denying it. She had hair the color of dark honey, pinned up in a way that seemed too elegant for a place like this, and a face that could have been carved from porcelain. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that shimmered as she moved, catching the light like a trapped star. She danced not with the wild abandon of a saloon girl, but with a strange, formal grace, as if she were performing in a grand ballroom for an audience of ghosts. Her movements were fluid, perfect, but her eyes were empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. It was as if the woman dancing was merely a shell, her spirit having fled long ago to some place no one in this room could ever reach. Her smile was a painted thing, a mask that did not fit, cracking at the edges. Eli watched, his whiskey untouched, a cold knot forming in his gut. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a deer caught in a trap, aware of its fate but too broken to fight. He noticed the chain then. It was a delicate thing, made of silver, barely visible against her ankle, but it was there. It ran from her leg to a small ring bolted to the stage floor, long enough to give her room to dance, short enough to remind everyone what she was, a possession, property. A large, florid man with a diamond stick pin in his cravat moved through the crowd, clapping men on the back. This was Silas Croft. The owner, Eli knew the type. Men who saw the world as a collection of things to be bought, sold, or broken. "A beauty, ain't she?" Croft boomed to a table of high-stakes poker players. "Best dancer this side of the Mississippi. Pure class. That one. Her name's Clara." He patted her on the back as she finished a turn near the edge of the stage, his touch lingering. She did not flinch, her expression unchanged. "She's the grand prize. Gentlemen, end of the week. The highest bidder takes her home. A contract, clean and simple. Best prize a man could win in this town." The men laughed, raising their glasses. Some threw coins onto the stage. They clinked and rolled around her feet. She paid them no mind, continuing her sad, silent ballet, a puppet on a silver string. Eli felt an old, familiar anger begin to smolder deep inside him, the kind he had spent years learning to bury. He did not want to feel it. He wanted to finish his drink, walk out the door, and forget he had ever seen her face. He was just passing through. This was not his fight. But then, her dance brought her toward his end of the stage. For a moment, her circuitous path put her directly in front of him, only a few feet away. The painted smile faltered. Her eyes, those dead, haunted eyes, lifted and met his. In that instant, something shifted. Maybe it was because he was the only man in the room not leering, not seeing a prize to be won. Maybe she saw the ghost of his own pain reflected in his gaze. He didn't know, but she saw something. She dipped low in her dance, her silk dress pooling around her. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade into a dull roar, leaning forward just enough for her voice to cross the small space between them, a voice no louder than the rustle of dry leaves. She whispered 2 sentences that would shatter his solitude forever. "Don't just watch," she said, her eyes boring into his, pleading and defiant all at once. "Buy me." The words hit him like a physical blow. It was not a seduction. It was not a tease. It was the rawest prayer he had ever heard. Eli stood up straight. He put a coin on the bar to pay for the whiskey he hadn't drunk, turned his back on the stage, and walked out of the gilded cage. He did not look back. The cool night air did nothing to calm the fire in his chest. He walked through the muddy streets, past the drunks and the shadows. The image of her chained ankle and dead eyes burned into his mind. He had come to Bisbee to be alone, to be empty, and in a single whisper, this woman had filled him with a purpose he did not want and could not ignore. That night, sleep offered no escape. It dragged him back to a place he never wanted to see again. He was in his small cabin in the Colorado mountains, the air thick with the smell of pine and wood smoke, and then just smoke. He saw his wife, Sarah, her face pale, her hand pressed against her swollen belly. He saw the glint of steel in another man's hand, a dispute over a strip of land the railroad wanted, a dispute that had turned to murder. He felt the sickening helplessness of being too late, of holding her as the life drained out of her, her blood a dark stain on the rough floorboards. Then the dream shifted. The helplessness was gone. replaced by a white-hot rage that consumed everything. He saw his own hands, strong and sure, closing around a rifle. He saw the face of the man who had killed her, the surprise and fear in his eyes. He heard the deafening roar of the shot, and then another, and another. He saw the man fall, and when he looked down at his hands again, they were covered in blood. His wife's blood, her killer's blood. It was all the same. It was the blood of his failure. He woke with a gasp. The sheets of the cheap bed tangled around him, his body slick with a cold sweat. The phantom smell of smoke filled his nostrils. He sat up, staring into the darkness of the room, the ghost of Sarah's last whispered words echoing in his head. He had avenged her, but he had not saved her. He had become a man who ran, not from the law, but from the memory of that blood on his hands. But now there was a new image to haunt him, a dancer with dead eyes and a silver chain, a woman asking not to be loved or desired, but simply to be bought, an escape from one cage to another, because it was the only kind of escape she could imagine. The sun rose, painting the dirty window of his room a pale, sickly yellow. Eli Monroe knew then that he would not be leaving Bisbee today. He dressed slowly, his mind clear for the first time in years. The quiet life of solitude he had been chasing was a mirage. You couldn't outrun the world. You couldn't outrun yourself. All you could do was choose your fight. He walked out into the waking town, but he did not go to the stockyard to collect his money. Instead, he found a quiet corner in a small diner and ordered coffee. He began to listen. He was good at listening. He asked a few quiet, careful questions of the stable hand who had tended his horse, a young man with grievances against the whole town. He spoke to the weary woman who ran the general store, asking about the cost of supplies, his questions drifting gently toward the workings of the saloons. He bought a drink for a disgruntled miner who had lost his pay at the gilded cage and let the man's bitter complaints wash over him. Slowly, piece by ugly piece, the story came together. It was not just Silas Croft. It was a network, a quiet, orderly business of human misery. Young women were brought to town, often from back east, with promises of good work as seamstresses or maids. Once here, they were presented with a bill, a debt contract, for their travel, their lodging, their food. The numbers were impossibly high, the interest crippling. The contracts were signed, often by women who could not read, and witnessed by the town mayor himself, a man named Josiah Hargrove, giving them the thin veneer of law. Once indebted, they belonged to Croft. They worked in his saloon, dancing, serving drinks, and worse. Every penny they earned going against a debt that only ever grew larger. They were trapped, bound more tightly by ink and paper than any silver chain. Clara, he learned, had been here for 2 years. She was Croft's prized possession because she had never broken, not completely. She still had that elegant defiance, a flicker of a soul that he was determined to sell to the highest bidder before it extinguished completely. Eli finished his coffee. The sun was higher in the sky now, baking the dust of Brewery Gulch. He looked at his own hands, resting on the table. They were calloused and scarred from years of roping cattle and mending fences. They were the hands that had failed to save his wife. They were the hands that had taken a man's life. He clenched them into fists. Perhaps, he thought, it was time they were used for something else. Before the dust and the whiskey, there was the scent of beeswax and old hymnals. Clara remembered it with a clarity that was a special kind of torture. She remembered the solid feel of her father's hand, the deep, resonant timbre of his voice as it filled the small Missouri church, speaking of grace and redemption, words that now seemed like a language from a dead and distant land. She was the preacher's daughter, a girl of sunshine and scraped knees, whose world was built on the unshakable foundations of faith and love. Then came the fire. It came in the night, a hungry, roaring beast that swallowed the clapboard house and the 2 people inside it. She woke to screaming, to the smell of burning pine and something else, something terrible. Her uncle, her father's brother, a man whose own faith had long ago drowned in a bottle, pulled her from the window of her small room. He was the one who saved her, and he was the one who sold her. The memory was not a story in her head, but a series of sharp, disconnected images. The acrid smell of smoke that clung to her clothes for weeks. The cold finality of the 2 fresh graves behind the blackened ruins of the church. Her uncle's shifty, bloodshot eyes as he explained that there was nothing left for her, that he had made an arrangement for her care with a kind man in the next town over. The man was not kind. The arrangement was a contract, a piece of paper her uncle signed with a shaky hand in exchange for a pouch of coins that he did not let her see. She was 14 years old. That was the first sale. There had been others. Each time the contract was sold, her debt mysteriously larger than before. She was moved to another town, another saloon, another stage, from Missouri to Kansas, Kansas to Colorado, and now, finally, to the barren heart of Arizona. The men and the towns blurred into one another. A long, gray smear of cigar smoke, cheap perfume, and the sound of men's laughter. She had learned to survive. She learned that tears were a weakness they enjoyed, so she never cried where they could see. She learned that a smile, no matter how false, was a shield. And she learned to dance. Dancing was the only thing that was truly hers. In the movement, in the practiced steps and graceful turns, she could retreat into a silent, walled-off part of her mind where no one could touch her. She could be the music, and nothing else. She could perform the part of the beautiful, desirable creature they wanted, while her true self, the preacher's daughter who remembered the smell of beeswax, curled into a small, tight knot deep inside, waiting. She had long ago given up on waiting for salvation. Now, she just waited for the end. But then, the quiet man had appeared at the back of the saloon. In the nights that followed his first appearance, she found her eyes searching for him. He was there each evening, standing in the same spot, a single glass of whiskey on the bar before him that he rarely seemed to touch. He was different from the others. The miners and ranchers and gamblers looked at her with a hot, crude ownership in their eyes. They saw a body, a prize, a thing. This man, he looked at her, and she felt seen. It was a terrifying feeling. He did not smile or leer. His gaze was heavy, patient, and filled with a sorrow that resonated with her own. He looked at her as if he knew that the shell on the stage was not the whole story, as if he could see the girl drowning in the silence behind her eyes. It was his quiet attention that had compelled her to speak, to whisper that desperate, insane plea, "Buy me." Since then, he had not returned. The hope, a tiny, foolish spark, had been extinguished. It was for the best. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this. Eli had spent 2 days moving in the shadows of Bisbee, a ghost in a town of hungry ghosts. His questions had given him the shape of Croft's operation, but he needed to see the machinery of it himself. He learned that a new wagon of recruits was due to arrive. On the 3rd night after his visit to the gilded cage, he waited. He found a perch in the darkness of a narrow alley across from the stagecoach office, a spot that offered a clear view of the street but kept him shrouded in blackness. Hours passed. The moon, a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, climbed overhead. At last, a dilapidated freight wagon, its canvas cover stained and torn, rumbled into town. It did not stop at the hotel. It continued through the main thoroughfare, turning up a steep, winding track that led to the hills overlooking the town. 2 men rode with it, rough-looking men with rifles laid across their saddles. Eli followed on foot. He moved with the practiced silence of a hunter, keeping to the rocks and the deep pockets of shadow. The wagon creaked and groaned its way to a secluded, flat clearing where 2 miserable-looking cabins stood. They were little more than shacks, their windows boarded over, a single door on each. He watched from a distance as the men herded 4 young women from the back of the wagon. They were pale and thin, their clothes threadbare, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and fear. They looked like lost lambs being led into a wolf's den. The men shoved them into one of the cabins, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. A thick wooden bar was dropped into place, locking them in. Eli remained in the darkness, a cold, patient anger settling over him. He watched as the two guards built a small fire, passing a bottle back and forth, their laughter ugly and loud in the night's stillness. He waited until their talk faded, until their heads drooped, until one was snoring softly and the other stared into the dying embers of the fire, lost in a drunken haze. Then Eli moved. He circled around the clearing, silent as an owl on the wing, approaching the cabins from the rear. He had seen that the second cabin was unused, its door unsecured. He slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of despair and unwashed bodies. A sliver of moonlight through a crack in the roof showed him piles of dirty straw that served as beds. This was where they were kept, broken in spirit before being put on display. He was about to leave when he heard a small sound from the first cabin, the one where the new girls were. It was a cough, weak and ragged. Then another. He moved to the wall that separated the two small buildings. Pressing his ear against the rough-hewn planks, he could hear soft crying and the low, comforting murmur of another woman's voice. He stood there for a long time, a helpless sentry, the sounds of their suffering a brand on his conscience. He returned the next night, and the night after that. He became a creature of the darkness, watching the comings and goings, learning the routine. The women were kept locked away, fed little more than scraps, and visited only by Croft's men. On the third night of his vigil, he saw one of the men drag a girl from the cabin. She was barely conscious, her body limp. He carried her not toward town, but toward a ravine at the edge of the clearing. He dumped her over the side like a sack of garbage and walked back to the fire without a second glance. The rage that Eli had kept banked for so many years roared to life. It was a clean, white-hot fire, burning away all hesitation, all doubt. He waited until the guards were asleep again, and then he made his way down into the ravine. He found her lying among the rocks and thorny bushes. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her face was blue in the moonlight, her eyes staring, unseeing, at the indifferent stars. Her wrists were raw, her body thin as a starved bird. She had died of sickness and neglect, a life thrown away because it was no longer profitable. Eli looked at her peaceful, broken face and saw the faces of all the others, the Apache child, the woman beaten in the street, Sarah. He saw the world's casual cruelty, its endless, grinding appetite for the weak. He would not leave her for the coyotes. He carried her out of the ravine, his muscles straining. He took her to a small grove of stunted junipers a short distance away. He had no shovel. He used his bare hands. He dug for hours, the rocky soil tearing at his flesh, his fingernails splitting and bleeding. He did not feel the pain. He dug until the hole was deep enough, and then he gently laid her in it. He said no prayer. He did not know any that felt true anymore. But he covered her over, stone by stone, handful by handful of earth, until she was reclaimed by the silent, waiting land. It was the only act of grace he could offer. He walked back into Bisbee as the sun was rising, the dirt of the grave under his nails, his hands raw and bleeding. His course was set. The time for watching was over. That evening, he walked back into the gilded cage. The place was just as loud, just as grimy as before. Silas Croft was standing by the poker table, a fat cigar jutting from his mouth. Eli walked straight toward him, his path cutting through the crowd. Men turned to look, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, the cold purpose that radiated from the quiet stranger. Eli stopped in front of Croft. He was taller than the saloon owner by a head, his frame lean but hard. "I want to buy the dancer," he said, his voice low and even. Yet it cut through the noise of the saloon. Croft took the cigar from his mouth and laughed, a wet, wheezing sound. "Clara, She ain't for sale to just any drifter with a few dollars in his pocket. She's the grand prize. The auction is at the end of the week." "I'm not waiting for the auction," Eli said. "I'm buying her now. Name your price." Croft's amusement faded, replaced by a sneer. He looked Eli up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the dusty boots. He saw a man with nothing. "You couldn't afford her, friend. She has an outstanding debt, a significant one, a legal contract." "I'll pay the debt," Eli said. "All of it, for her contract, free and clear." The saloon owner's eyes glinted with a cruel, avaricious light. He saw a fool, and he intended to fleece him. He named a number. It was an astronomical sum, enough to buy a sizable ranch, a figure designed to silence and humiliate. The men at the nearby tables who had overheard it let out low whistles. Eli did not flinch. He simply nodded. "I'll be back," he said, and turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He went first to the man who was buying his cattle. He collected the money, a decent sum, but less than a quarter of what Croft was demanding. Then he went to the livery. He found the owner and sold him his horse, the buckskin that had carried him faithfully across 1,000 miles of unforgiving country. He sold the saddle, the bridle, and the bedroll. It hurt him more than he would have admitted, like selling a part of himself. Next, he went to the gunsmith. He laid his Colt Peacemaker on the counter, the one that had been his constant companion for 10 years. Then he laid his Winchester rifle beside it. The gunsmith, a shrewd man, knew a desperate seller when he saw one and offered him a fraction of their worth. Eli took the money without haggling. He was still short. There was only one thing left. He went to the land office. The clerk was a weaselly man with ink-stained fingers. Eli produced the deed to his small land claim in Colorado, the one he had ridden away from, the one where his wife was buried. It was the last piece of his old life, a place of ghosts and bitter memories. But it was still his. He sold it for a pittance to a speculator connected to the railroad, the very same company whose ambitions had led to Sarah's death. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He walked out of the land office with a final handful of banknotes, his pockets heavy with the price of his own past. He was a man untethered, with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and the money in his hand. He walked back to the gilded cage. The crowd parted for him as he entered. Croft was waiting, a smug look on his face. Eli walked to the bar, took the wads of cash from his pockets, and laid them out. He counted the full sum, banknote by banknote. When he was done, he pushed the pile of money toward Croft. "Her contract," Eli said. Croft's eyes were wide. He licked his lips, his greed overriding his surprise. He scurried to the back room and returned with a piece of paper. He signed the bottom with a flourish, transferring the debt and ownership. Then he barked an order to one of his men, who disappeared up the stairs. A moment later, Clara was led down. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her face pale. She saw Eli standing at the bar, and then she saw the money and the paper. A look of weary resignation settled over her features. Another sale, another town, another master. She looked at Eli, her eyes holding no hope, no curiosity, only the dead, flat acceptance of her fate. Eli took the contract, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He turned to Clara. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than she would have expected. He led her out of the saloon and into the night. She followed a step behind him, a ghost trailing in his wake, waiting for him to lead her to the hotel, to a room where the transaction would be completed in the usual, degrading way. But he did not turn toward the hotel. He led her past the livery stable, past the last of the saloons, to the edge of town where the dark, silent desert began. He stopped in front of a small, dilapidated cabin that sagged to one side as if the wind had tried to push it over. It was little more than a shack, abandoned and forgotten. "This," she thought, "this is the place." Her stomach tightened. Eli pushed the door open. It creaked in protest. He stepped aside. gesturing for her to enter. The cabin was a single room, mostly empty. There was a stone fireplace, a rickety table with one chair, and a narrow cot in the corner with a thin, patched blanket on it. A lantern on the table cast a weak, flickering glow. On the table, next to the lantern, was a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and a clean, folded dress of simple gray wool he must have bought at the mercantile. He did not follow her in. He stood in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the night sky. "The food is for you," he said. "The dress is clean. You can have the bed." Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process his words. This was wrong, all of it. The silence, the food, the offer of the bed. It did not fit the pattern of her life. She was braced for a demand, for a rough hand, for the violation she had come to expect as her due. The absence of it left her feeling untethered, more frightened than she had been by any act of cruelty. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a harsh whisper. Eli looked at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. He seemed to understand the fear and suspicion coiling inside her. He did not answer her question directly. "You're safe here," he said. "Get some rest." He pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the flickering lamplight. She heard his footsteps outside, and then the sound of his body settling on the ground, his back against the outside wall of the cabin. He was going to sleep on the ground, out in the cold. A guard. Clara looked at the clean dress, the humble offering of food, the empty room. Her mind spun with a dizzying mix of confusion, suspicion, and a sudden, sharp anger. Who was this man? What kind of cruel, elaborate game was this? She thought about running. She could slip out the back window, disappear into the desert. But where would she go? To another town, another croft, another contract? She sank down into the single chair, the anger draining out of her, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it felt as if it went all the way to her bones. For the first time in years, there was no lock on the door. For the first time in years, a man had asked for nothing. She was free to go, and she was too tired to run. The first days in the cabin were a silent war. Clara moved through the small space with a coiled, watchful energy. A creature testing the dimensions of a new cage, searching for the hidden trap. She expected a price to be paid for the food, for the clean dress, for the cot she slept on alone each night. Every morning she woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe as Eli chopped wood, and every evening she watched from the doorway as he settled on the hard-packed earth outside, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He never tried the door. He never spoke unless she spoke first, and his answers were short, clipped things, like stones dropped into a deep well. He would leave food for her on the table, a rabbit he had snared, a handful of bitter roots he had dug from the dry soil, and then retreat, giving her space, giving her silence. She tested him. On the third day, she left the door slightly ajar when she went to the nearby creek for water. She watched from the corner of her eye, expecting him to enter the cabin, to rummage through the few meager belongings she now had, to assert the ownership he had paid for. He did not move from his spot by the woodpile. On the fifth day, she spoke to him, her voice intentionally soft, almost inviting. "The nights are cold. You'll catch your death on the ground." He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his gray eyes holding hers for a moment. "I'm fine," he said, and went back to his work. The lack of demand was a form of slow, psychological torture. It chipped away at the walls she had built so carefully over the years. Cruelty. She understood. Neglect. She knew intimately. The brutish, transactional nature of men was the only gospel she had ever learned. But this quiet, persistent respect was a foreign language, and it unnerved her more than any threat. She began to see the details of him, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the way his hands, though scarred and calloused, were gentle when he tended the small fire. He was a man made of contradictions, of violence and stillness, and she could not decipher him. One night, a week after he had brought her there, the question that had been burning inside her finally broke free. The cabin was filled with a tense, fragile quiet. The only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He was sitting on a log just outside the open door, staring out at the star-dusted desert. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you buy me?" He did not turn. For a long time. She thought he would not answer, that he would leave her question to hang in the air and die like all the others. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an old, deep pain. "Because you shouldn't belong to any man." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. They were the key to a lock she had forgotten existed. They spoke not of her, but of a principle, a belief forged in a fire she couldn't imagine. He still didn't look at her, but she knew, in that moment, that his gaze was turned inward, back to a time and a place that had broken him. He was seeing a different fire, not the comforting one in the hearth, but the greedy, angry one that had consumed his world. The memory rose in him unbidden, sharp and clear as broken glass. He was back in Colorado, in the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. He could smell the pine in the air and the stew Sarah was making for supper. He saw her turn from the stove, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. Her smile was the only true sunlight he had ever known. She was 6 months along, and her every movement was filled with a quiet, miraculous grace. They had a life, a real one, carved out of the wilderness with love and hard work. Then the railroad men came. They wanted his land, not for the tracks themselves, but for the water rights to the creek that ran through it. Their offer was an insult, their threats veiled in the cold language of progress and eminent domain. The foreman, a man named Brody with a face like a clenched fist, had looked at Sarah, at her belly, and then at Eli, and had sneered. "Everything has a price. Some are just harder to collect." Eli had refused. He had stood his ground. He thought that was what a man was supposed to do. A week later, he returned from a trip to town for supplies to find the cabin door splintered and hanging from a single hinge. He found Sarah on the floor. Brody had come back, not to negotiate, but to take. He had taken everything. She was gone. The child was gone. The light of the world had gone out. The man that rode out of those mountains was not the same one who had ridden in. The grief was a living thing, a cold, black stone in his chest. But beneath it was a rage as pure and hot as a blacksmith's forge. He tracked Brody and his men for 3 days. He did not want justice from a court. He wanted vengeance, a biblical settling of accounts. He found them at a camp by the river. He did not give them a chance to draw. The Winchester in his hands was not a tool for hunting, but an instrument of wrath. When it was over, 3 men lay dead, and the blood on Eli's hands felt like a sacrament and a damnation all at once. He was a husband. He was a father who would never be, and now he was a killer. He had fled, not from the law, which was barely a rumor in those parts, but from the ghost of the man he had been, and the specter of the man he had become. "No one should be a piece of property," he said again, his voice pulling him back from the edge of that cold, dark memory. He finally turned his head and looked at Clara. No one. 2 weeks after she came to the cabin, Clara fell ill. It started with a chill she couldn't shake, a deep ache in her bones. By nightfall, she was burning with fever, her body trembling under the thin blanket. The sickness that had taken the girl in Croft's holding cabin had found her, too. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her delirium. She was weak, a liability. She expected him to leave her, to cut his losses and disappear back into the desert that had spawned him. Instead, he came inside. He closed the door against the night's chill and built up the fire until the small cabin was warm. He moved with a quiet, surprising competence. When she was seized by violent fits of nausea, he was there, holding her head, his other hand holding her hair back from her face, his touch firm and impersonal. He spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, not of comfort, but of practical things. "It's all right, let it pass." He bathed her forehead with a rag dipped in cool water from the creek. He coaxed spoonfuls of thin broth between her lips when she was too weak to lift her head. The fever raged for 3 days. She drifted in and out of a nightmare world of smoke and leering faces, of silver chains and the sound of men's laughter. But through it all, there was a constant, steady presence. Eli. In her moments of lucidity, she would see him sitting in the chair by her cot, watching over her. Once, she woke in the dead of night to find him reading. He had a small, tattered book, and his voice was a low rumble as he read aloud. Not for her, but as if to fill the silence, to keep the darkness at bay. It was a farmer's almanac. He read about planting seasons and the phases of the moon, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the stormy sea of her fever. She had not been read to since she was a little girl, sitting at her father's feet. The simple, unexpected kindness of it was a balm on a wound she had not known was still open. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She woke feeling weak and hollowed out, but clear-headed for the first time in days. The cabin was quiet. Eli was sitting at the table, mending a piece of tack, his head bent in concentration. The morning sun streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt peaceful, safe. She pushed herself up on one elbow. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He looked up, his expression unreadable. He rose and brought her a dipper of water. She drank greedily, the cool liquid a blessing on her parched throat. He watched her, a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, before his usual guarded mask slipped back into place. She looked down at his hands as he took the dipper back. They were large and rough, the knuckles scarred, the nails rimmed with dirt. These were the hands that had held her head, that had bathed her brow. They were hands that had saved her. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her own hand, pale and thin, over his. He flinched as if he had been burned. He pulled his hand back instantly, a sharp, involuntary motion. The connection was broken. He stood up, turning away from her, and busied himself with the fire, his back a rigid wall of muscle and regret. The rejection was as clear and cold as a winter morning. He could be her caretaker, her guardian, but not her equal. The walls around him were higher and thicker than any she had ever built. The fragile peace of their isolation was not meant to last. Word of what Eli had done had spread through Bisbee like a contagion. A drifter walking into the gilded cage and buying Silas Croft's prize dancer outright was the biggest news the town had seen in months. The story was told and retold in every saloon and gambling den, growing more elaborate with each telling. Eli Monroe became a folk hero to some, a fool to others, to Silas Croft and Mayor Hargrove. He was a threat to their entire enterprise. One afternoon, a horseman approached the cabin. It was the sheriff. He dismounted heavily, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his drooping mustache doing little to hide the displeasure on his face. Eli met him outside, positioning himself between the sheriff and the cabin door. "Monroe," the sheriff said, foregoing any pleasantries, "you're causing a whole heap of trouble." "I'm not looking for trouble," Eli replied, his voice even. "Well, you've found it," the sheriff grumbled. "Croft is furious. He's saying you swindled him, that the girl is his property until her contract is officially transferred by the mayor's office, which ain't happened. He wants her back. He says you've abducted her." "I bought her contract, paid in full." "It's a gray area, legally speaking," the sheriff said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "And in this town, the gray areas belong to Croft and the mayor. I'm here as a courtesy. Bring the girl back to town by tomorrow, or Croft is going to come for her with a dozen men. When that happens, I won't be able to stop what comes next. It'll be your funeral. Monroe, He gave Eli a long, hard look. "She ain't worth dying for." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving his threat hanging in the dry desert air. Clara had heard everything from inside the cabin. "She ain't worth dying for?" The words echoed in her ears, a sentiment she had long ago accepted as truth. She had watched this quiet, broken man spend every last thing he owned for her. She had let him care for her, protect her. She would not let him die for her. That night, she waited until he was asleep, his rhythmic breathing a slow, steady sound in the darkness outside her door. She dressed in the gray wool dress. She had nothing to pack, nothing to take. She wrote a short note on a piece of wrapping paper she found, using a small nub of charcoal from the hearth. She left it on the table. Then, silent as a shadow, she slipped out the small back window. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away, to draw the trouble away from him. The train station was her only thought, the only symbol of escape she knew. She would stow away on a freight car, go anywhere, become nameless again. It was a fate she understood. The train station was a lonely, skeletal structure under the moonlight. The next eastbound train was not due until dawn. She huddled in the deep shadows of the water tower, shivering, waiting. She felt a profound and aching sadness. For a few short weeks, in that dusty, broken-down cabin, she had felt something other than fear. She had been cared for. He had made her feel like a person, not property, as her note said. "You gave me a name again. That's more than I ever hoped for." A sound made her start, a footstep on the gravel. She shrank back further into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. But it was not Croft's men. It was Eli. He walked onto the platform, his tall frame cutting a stark figure against the pale horizon. He looked around, his search methodical, his gaze sweeping the shadows. He knew she would be here. He knew her that well. His eyes found her. He did not shout. He did not look angry. He simply walked toward her until he was standing a few feet away. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Please don't go," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its usual defenses. It was not a command. It was a plea, raw and honest. It was the sound of a man who had already lost everything, begging not to lose the one last thing he had found. And that was what finally broke her. The dam of 1,000 unshed tears, built over a decade of pain and humiliation, burst. A sob tore from her throat, a ragged, ugly sound. Then another. The tears came, hot and unstoppable, streaming down her face, washing away the years of forced smiles and silent endurance. She cried for the little girl whose parents had been stolen by fire, for the young woman sold by her own blood, for every degrading touch and empty-eyed stare she had endured. She collapsed into herself, and he was there. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest. It was an awkward, clumsy embrace, the embrace of a man who had forgotten the shape of comfort. But it was solid. It was real. He held her as she shook, his hand stroking her hair, his own body rigid with the effort of offering a solace he did not know how to give. When her sobs finally subsided, she was left limp and exhausted in his arms. She leaned back, looking up at his face in the pre-dawn light. His eyes were filled with a pained tenderness that stole her breath. This man, who flinched from her touch, was holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Slowly, tentatively, he lowered his head. She raised hers to meet him. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion or romance. It was a collision of two solitudes, a desperate, clumsy pressing of lips. It tasted of salt from her tears and the dust of the desert. It was hesitant, uncertain, and filled with all the pain and fear they both carried. But it was real, and in its fragile, aching reality. It was the first true thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. The morning after the train station was quiet and strange. The kiss had not magically healed them, but it had changed the air between them. charging it with a fragile, unspoken tenderness. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a shy, tentative gravity. The space he kept between them was no longer a declaration of distance, but a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the precious, breakable thing that was growing between them. A fragile peace settled over their small, isolated world. The rhythm of their days became a quiet routine of survival that slowly began to resemble a life. Eli, seeing that her fear of him had finally given way to a cautious trust, decided it was time she'd learn to ride. He borrowed a gentle mare from a prospector he knew, a man who lived far enough up in the hills to be free of Bisbee's poison. The lessons were clumsy at first. Clara was afraid of the animal's size and power, her body stiff with a lifetime of being contained. Eli was patient. He did not laugh at her fear. He spoke in a low, calm voice, his hands guiding hers on the reins, showing her how to feel the horse's movements, how to become a part of its rhythm instead of fighting it. His touch was brief, professional. Yet every time his fingers brushed against hers, a jolt passed between them. Slowly, her fear subsided, replaced by a budding confidence. She learned to sit tall in the saddle, to guide the mare with a gentle hand. One afternoon, she urged the horse into a canter across a stretch of open desert, the wind catching her hair. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a sense of freedom so pure it brought tears to her eyes. While he taught her to ride, she brought a different kind of life to the barren patch of earth behind the cabin. She had found a handful of forgotten squash seeds in the pocket of the wool dress Eli had bought for her. With a sharpened stick, she tilled the hard, dry soil, her movements careful and deliberate. She watered the small plot every morning with water from the creek, her hands tending to the potential for life with a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. It was a small, hopeful rebellion against the deadness of the desert, and the deadness that had lived inside her for so long. Their first laugh came on a day when a sudden, violent downpour swept through the canyon. They were caught out in it, a mile from the cabin. They ran, slipping and sliding in the mud, the rain plastering their clothes to their bodies. They stumbled through the cabin door, soaked and breathless, dripping water onto the dusty floor. Eli looked at her, her hair falling in dark, wet strands around her face, her gray dress clinging to her. A slow smile spread across his face, a sight so rare and unexpected it was like seeing the sun rise in the west. And then she saw herself in his eyes, a mess of mud and wet wool, and a laugh bubbled up out of her, a real, unforced sound she had not heard from her own lips since she was a child. He joined in, his laugh a low, rusty rumble. In that moment, surrounded by the storm, they were not a broken outlaw and a bought dancer. They were just a man and a woman, laughing in the rain. The peace was a thin sheet of ice over a dark, deep river, and they both knew it. It shattered on a Tuesday. A man on a tired-looking horse rode up to the cabin. He was not the sheriff. He was one of Silas Croft's men, a hired gun with cold, empty eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse like a vulture, looking down at Eli, who had stepped out to meet him. "Got a message for you," the man said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He held out a folded piece of paper. Eli took it. It was a formal-looking document, bearing the seal of the mayor's office. The language was cold and legal, full of clauses and threats. It stated that Clara's contract of indenture was still legally held by Mr. Silas Croft, pending a formal review of the sale. It accused Eli Monroe of abduction and of harboring a fugitive from a legal work agreement. It gave him an ultimatum: return the woman to the gilded cage within 24 hours, or a warrant would be issued for his arrest, and he would be hunted down as a wanted criminal. Eli's face was stone as he read it. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Tell Croft he's not getting her back," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The man shrugged. "Your choice, but they'll get you both. There ain't nowhere in this territory you can hide from the mayor's reach." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread behind him. Clara had come to the doorway, her face pale. She had seen the look in the man's eyes. The official paper in Eli's hand. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. He told her. When he was finished, he looked at her, his jaw set with a grim determination. "We'll run," he said. "We'll pack what we can and ride north tonight. We can lose them in the mountains." Clara shook her head, a terrible certainty dawning in her eyes. She had seen how this world worked. Men like Croft did not give up what they considered theirs. Men like Eli, men who stood against them, were ground into the dust. "No," she said softly. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "They'll kill me, Clara, and they'll take you back." "Yes," she said, her gaze unwavering. "They will, if they catch you, and they will never stop looking. They will hunt you across this whole territory and hang you for a crime you didn't commit. All for me." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I've spent my life watching men destroy themselves for want of something. I will not be the reason they destroy you." "I'm not afraid of them," he growled. "I know," she said, and her voice broke. "That's what terrifies me." She looked around the small, poor cabin that had become her first real home. She looked at the patch of earth where her seeds were just beginning to sprout, and she looked at him, at the good, broken man who had shown her a kindness she thought no longer existed in the world. She would not be his ruin. That night, she pretended to agree. She helped him pack a small canvas sack with the last of their food and 2 canteens of water. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the one he had bought back from the gunsmith with the last of his cattle money. He was so focused on the fight to come that he did not see the quiet finality in her eyes. She waited until his breathing deepened into the slow, rhythmic pattern of sleep. Her heart felt like a stone in her chest. She took the note she had already written and placed it on the table where he would see it. She allowed herself one last look at his face, peaceful in sleep, the hard lines softened by the firelight. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. She would not cry. She had done enough of that. She slipped out the back window and ran, her feet sure and silent on the path to town. She did not look back. Eli woke to an unnatural silence. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin felt cold and empty. He knew, even before he saw the note. He knew it in the pit of his stomach. He saw the piece of paper on the table, her neat, careful handwriting a stark contrast to the frantic scrawl of his own thoughts. "You gave me a name again. That's more than I ever hoped for." Devastation hit him first, a hollow, breathless punch to the gut. She was gone. She had sacrificed herself to save him, but the grief was quickly consumed by a blinding, cleansing rage. He did not think about running. He did not think about hiding. He thought only of her, back in that gilded cage, her eyes dead again, her spirit broken. He had lost his wife because he was not there to protect her. He would not fail again. He stormed out of the cabin, leaving the packed supplies where they lay. He rode the borrowed mare hard, pushing it faster than he ever had before. The wind tearing at his face, he rode straight for the heart of Bisbee, straight for the doors of the gilded cage. He burst through the swinging doors like a vengeful spirit. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with smoke and the frantic, joyless music of the piano. And there she was, on the stage, just as he had feared. Croft had put her in a dress the color of fresh blood. Her face was a pale, powdered mask, her movements stiff and mechanical, a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. Her eyes, once so full of a fragile, budding hope, were empty. She was looking at nothing, seeing nothing. She was gone again, retreated to that silent place deep inside. When she saw him, a flicker of horror crossed her face. A silent scream she could not voice. He did not see it. He saw only Croft, standing by the bar, a triumphant smirk on his face. Eli's hand went to the Colt on his hip. He drew the gun, the click of the hammer being cocked a sound that cut through the saloon's noise like a whip crack. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. The room fell silent. "Croft!" Eli's voice was a roar. "You and me, right now!" Croft's smirk widened. "I don't think so. Monroe—" He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. It was not a duel. It was a trap. The men who had seemed like simple patrons and gamblers suddenly moved with a coordinated purpose. A man standing behind Eli brought a whiskey bottle down on the back of his head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He staggered, his vision blurring. Before he could recover, 3 more men were on him, pinning his arms. Someone kicked his legs out from under him, and he crashed to the floor. The gun was kicked from his hand. He fought with the strength of a wild animal, but there were too many of them. Fists and boots rained down on him. A brutal, merciless beating. He felt his ribs crack, tasted the coppery tang of his own blood. Through the haze of pain, he could see Clara, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Croft's men dragged him to his feet. They forced his arms behind his back and bound them with a length of rope. Then another man came forward with heavy iron chains. They chained his hands and feet, the cold metal biting into his skin. Croft walked up to him, his face smug. "You should have run when you had the chance. Hero!" he sneered. And then he drove his fist into Eli's stomach. Eli doubled over, gasping for air. They dragged him out of the saloon and into the street, a spectacle for the whole town. They threw him onto the back of a horse and led him out into the desert, to the same desolate patch of land where Croft kept his cabins. They took him to the edge of the ravine where the young girl had been thrown. There, they chained him to a thick iron stake that had been driven deep into the ground. They left him there, under the merciless sun, without water, to die of thirst and exposure. A warning to anyone else who might think of defying the real law in Bisbee. Clara was dragged upstairs and locked in a small, windowless room. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. This was all her fault. Her noble sacrifice had been a fool's errand. It had not saved him. It had led him to his slaughter. She had to get out. She had to get to him. She waited for hours, listening. Late in the night, she heard the clumsy footsteps of a guard outside her door. She heard the scrape of a key in the lock. The man who entered was drunk, his eyes glazed with lust. It was the chance she needed. As he lunged for her, she sidestepped, grabbing the heavy water pitcher from the washstand. She brought it down on his head with all her strength. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. She didn't hesitate. She took his keys, crept down the back stairs and out into an alley. She ran, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Where would they have taken him? She thought of the cold-eyed man who had delivered the note, of the direction he had come from. She remembered the stories she had heard the other girls whisper, stories of a place in the hills where women were kept, a place of punishment. She had a hunch, a desperate gut feeling about where a man like Croft would leave another man to die. Not just killed, but made an example of. She followed the track out of town, her feet finding the path in the pale moonlight. It was a long, exhausting journey. She found the clearing, the 2 miserable cabins, and then she saw the ravine. A low moan reached her ears. It was him. He was barely conscious, his body a broken mess. His face was swollen and bruised, his lips cracked and bleeding. The sun had baked him for hours, and he was severely dehydrated. The chains were heavy and thick. She had no way to break them, but the stake was in the ground. She worked frantically, her bare hands digging at the hard-packed earth around the iron stake. She clawed at the dirt and rocks, her fingers bleeding, her muscles screaming in protest. She dug until the ground was loose enough, and then she pulled, using every ounce of her strength, her body straining against the weight of the stake and the man attached to it. With a final, agonizing heave, the stake came free. He was a dead weight. She had to get him to water. She half dragged, half carried him, pulling him away from the ravine, toward the creek she knew was nearby. It took what felt like an eternity. She collapsed at the water's edge, her body trembling with exhaustion. She splashed water on his face, dribbled it between his cracked lips. He coughed, choked, and then drank. His first swallows weak and ragged. She tore strips from her dress to clean his wounds, her touch gentle, her movements focused. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometime near dawn, his eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they focused on her face, hovering over him. Surprise flickered in their depths. He tried to speak, but his throat was too raw. She leaned in close, her hair falling around his face, her own tears finally beginning to fall, not in sorrow, but in a fierce, defiant relief. She looked into his eyes, and she finally said the words that had been born in that train station, the words that were truer than anything she had ever known. "I'm not yours," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want to be—" Her words hung in the cold, pre-dawn air, a vow and a prayer all at once. For a moment, the world consisted only of her face, illuminated by the pale moonlight, and the impossible truth in her eyes. But the sound of a distant rider, probably one of Croft's men checking the trap, shattered the stillness. They could not stay here. He was a broken man, and she was a hunted woman. But together, they were alive, and that was enough to fight for. Getting him away from the ravine was an ordeal of strength and sheer will. Every movement sent waves of agony through Eli's body, and he leaned on Clara with a weight that would have crushed a person with a less resolute spirit. She became his crutch, his guide, his entire world. She led them away from the open desert and into the jagged, rising foothills of the Mule Mountains. The ascent was a slow, torturous crawl. More than once, he stumbled and fell, his body refusing to obey. Each time, she was there, her slender frame straining, her voice a low, steady whisper in his ear. "Get up, Eli, we're almost there, just a little further." She had a destination in mind, a place she had heard the old prospectors talk about in whispers, an abandoned silver mine, played out and forgotten decades ago. It was a tomb in the side of the mountain, a place no one would think to look. It took them the better part of the day to find it, a dark slash in the rock face, hidden behind a thicket of thorny mesquite. The air inside the mine shaft was cold and still, carrying the scent of damp stone and a deep, ancient darkness. It was a place devoid of life, and, for that reason, it was the safest place on earth for them. Clara helped Eli limp deep into the tunnel, far from the entrance, to a place where the outside light could not penetrate. She made him a bed from her own torn dress and a pile of dry leaves she had gathered, and then she collapsed beside him, her body finally surrendering to an exhaustion so complete it was a kind of death itself. The days that followed were a long, slow climb back into the world of the living. Eli's recovery was not swift. His ribs were cracked, his face a swollen mask of bruises, and a deep, festering infection had taken hold in one of the wounds on his back. He was helpless, a state so foreign to him that it left him raw and exposed in ways the beating never could. He was completely at her mercy, and her mercy was absolute. Clara became a creature of the mountain. She would leave him in the darkness of the mine for hours at a time, foraging for anything that could sustain them. She returned with handfuls of bitter berries, tough roots she had dug from the rocky soil with a sharp stone, and once, triumphantly, with 2 small fish she had managed to catch in a mountain stream with her bare hands. She learned the rhythms of the wilderness out of sheer necessity, her senses sharpening, her body growing lean and hard. She tended to his wounds with a fierce, protective focus. She found a plant with broad, cool leaves that seemed to soothe his fever, and she cleaned the infection on his back with water she boiled in a battered tin cup she had found near the mine's entrance. In the long hours in the darkness, they talked. The blackness of the mine was a confessional, stripping away the last of their pretenses, leaving only the unvarnished truth of who they were. He would lie on his back, staring up at a ceiling he could not see, and listen to the sound of her voice, a melody in the suffocating silence. One night, as the distant howl of a coyote echoed through the mountains. She told him about a life before the saloons, a life she had thought she had forgotten completely. "I was in love once," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Before, when I was a girl in Missouri. His name was Thomas. He was a farmer's son. He had kind eyes and big, clumsy hands that were always gentle." She described a world of summer evenings and fireflies, of shared glances over a church picnic, of a single, chaste kiss stolen behind a barn. It was a simple, wholesome love, the kind that promised a life of quiet joys. "He was going to ask my father for my hand," she continued, her voice thick with the memory of it. "We were going to have a small farm, with a white fence and a field of corn. I used to dream about it, about the children we would have." She paused, the weight of that lost future filling the darkness. "Then the fire happened, and my uncle, he sold me. I never saw Thomas again. I heard he waited for me. For a year. He asked after me in every town, and then he just gave up. I don't blame him." She fell silent for a long time. "When they took me, it wasn't just my freedom they stole. They took that girl, the one Thomas loved. They buried her. And I promised myself I would never let another person see her again. To be seen like that, as a person, it was too dangerous. It hurt too much to remember what it felt like. I thought I would die in one of those saloons, and no one would ever know I had been anything more than a dancer." Eli listened, his own heart aching for the girl she had been. He finally understood the true depth of her emptiness, the profound loss that she had carried for so long. She had not just lost her freedom, she had lost her very self. A few nights later, it was his turn. She had been asking him about the scars on his knuckles, the ones that were old and faded, different from the fresh wounds of the beating. He had always deflected her questions before, but now, in the intimacy of their shared darkness, he found himself wanting to tell her, needing her to know the truth of the man who had laid claim to her life. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice rough. She was like you. She saw the good in things, even in me." He told her about their cabin, about the child they were expecting, about the land and the railroad. And then he told her about her final moments, a memory he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. "When I found her, she was still breathing. Just barely. I held her, but I knew there was nothing I could do." He had to stop, his throat closing around the words. He took a ragged breath and continued. "She knew it too. She looked at me, and she wasn't afraid. She was just sad, for me. She put her hand on my cheek, and she whispered something. Her last words." He fell silent, the memory of that moment as vivid and painful as the day it had happened. "What did she say?" Clara asked gently. Eli turned his head to look at her, though he could only see the faint outline of her form in the gloom. She said, "Find someone you can save. Don't drown with me." The words settled between them, a revelation that explained everything. His flight, his solitude, his desperate, inexplicable need to save Clara. It was not just a quest for justice. It was a dying woman's final wish. He had been drowning in his guilt, in his failure to save his family. And in saving Clara, he was finally trying to save himself, to honor the last request of the woman he had loved and lost. "I think," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for years. "I think she would have liked you." That night, something shifted between them. Their confessions had been a final offering of trust, a laying down of the ghosts that had haunted them. He was stronger now, able to sit up, the fever finally gone from his body. They sat side by side, their shoulders barely touching, but the space between them was electric. He reached for her hand, not as a patient, but as a man. She did not pull away. This time, he did not flinch, his fingers intertwined with hers, a quiet, simple gesture of possession that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. He leaned in and kissed her, It was not like their first kiss, which had been born of desperation and grief. This kiss was slow, deliberate, a question and an answer, all in one. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared survival, of a hope so new and fragile it barely dared to breathe. She kissed him back, pouring all of her unspoken fears and desires into the touch of her lips against his. In the cold, silent darkness of that forgotten mine, they made love for the first time. It was not an act of passion, but an act of grace. It was a quiet, solemn reclaiming of their own bodies, a declaration that they were more than the sum of their scars. For Eli, it was the first time a woman's touch had not been a reminder of what he had lost. For Clara, it was the first time a man's touch had been a choice. It was not a transaction. It was a covenant. While they found a fragile sanctuary in the mountains, the town of Bisbee festered below them. Silas Croft, enraged and humiliated by Eli's defiance and Clara's escape, conspired with Mayor Hargrove. They could not let this stand. It would show weakness. It would encourage others. They moved swiftly to control the narrative. They printed wanted posters and sent them out with the territorial marshals. The posters depicted a grim, bearded Eli Monroe, branding him a known outlaw and murderer, wanted for the abduction of a woman from the legal protection of her employer. Beneath his picture was a smaller, softer drawing of Clara, her face made to look innocent and victimized, though the text described her as a thief and a willing accomplice. A bounty was placed on their heads, $500 for Eli, dead or alive, $100 for the return of the woman. The story they told was that Monroe, a violent drifter, had become obsessed with Croft's prized dancer, had stolen her in the night, and was holding her against her will. The beating and chaining were conveniently omitted from the official account. Eli was the villain. Croft was the victim. And the law, in the form of the mayor's seal on the poster, backed him up. The town sheriff, a man named Miller, was caught in the middle. He was a man who had long ago made his peace with the town's corruption, choosing a quiet life over a righteous one. But this was different. He had a daughter, a girl who had run off to Tombstone a few years back and had fallen into a bad situation, tangled up with a gambler who had kept her in a state of debt not so different from Clara's. Miller had ridden there and brought her home, and he had seen the deadness in her eyes, the same look he had seen in Clara's on that stage. His conscience, long dormant, began to stir. He could not openly defy Croft and the mayor. They owned him as surely as they had owned Clara, but he could not be a party to a cold-blooded manhunt for a man whose only crime was an act of decency. So he did the only thing he could. He knew Eli was a smart man, a man who understood the land. He knew that if they were alive, they would need water. There were only a few reliable streams in that part of the mountains. One evening, Sheriff Miller rode out of town alone. He went to the stream where Clara had caught the fish, a place he knew was remote but accessible. He tucked a folded piece of paper inside a rusted can and wedged it between two rocks near the water's edge. It was one of the wanted posters. On the back, he had scrawled a short, anonymous message. "They are paying bounty hunters. Not safe in this territory. Go north." It was Clara who found it 2 days later when she went to fetch water. She saw the glint of the can and, driven by a prepper's curiosity, she retrieved it. Her blood ran cold as she unrolled the poster and saw their faces, their names, their crimes. She read the lies, the bounty, and then the sheriff's desperate warning on the back. She ran back to the mine, her heart pounding with a new and urgent fear. She showed the poster to Eli. He read it, his expression hardening into a familiar mask of grim resolve. They had known Croft would not let it go, but this was worse than they had imagined. They were not just being hunted. They were being erased, their story rewritten into a cheap, ugly fiction. "He's right," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We have to go north. We can get to Utah, change our names." Eli was silent, staring at the poster, at the lie that wore his face. He shook his head slowly. "They'll never stop," he said. A bounty like this, it'll follow us wherever we go. We'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Clara's face crumpled. The hope that had bloomed in the darkness of the mine began to wither. "Then I'll turn myself in," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "This is about me. If I go back, they'll have what they want. They'll let you go." "No," Eli said, his voice sharp and absolute. He took the poster from her hands and looked at her, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "They won't just let me go, and they won't just take you back. They'll make an example of us both. You would be broken for good, and I would hang. That's how this ends, unless we change the ending." "How?" she whispered. "We have nothing. We're trapped here." "We have the truth," he said, a new, dangerous idea taking shape in his mind. He thought of the contracts he had heard about, the systemic trade in women that Croft and Hargrove had built. He thought of the other girls, the one still trapped, the one he had buried with his own hands. Running had been his life for years, but running with Clara, for Clara, was not an option. You could not build a life on the run. You had to stand your ground. "We're not going north," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction that startled them both. "We're going back to Bisbee." The decision to return to Bisbee was the most terrifying and liberating choice either of them had ever made. It was a choice to stop running, to face the demons of the past not as individuals, but as a united force. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting for the right to a future. But to fight, they needed a weapon, and their only weapon was the truth. Before they could confront the town, they needed the proof. That meant a return to the place of Clara's long imprisonment, the gilded cage. They waited 2 nights, watching the saloon from a high, rocky perch, learning the routines of the men Croft had left to guard his assets. On the 3rd night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they moved. Eli, with the stealth of a predator, neutralized the single guard at the back door. A swift, silent action that left the man bound and gagged but unharmed. Clara was the one who led him through the sleeping building. She knew its secrets, its creaking floorboards, its hidden corners. She led him to Croft's office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and greed. While Eli stood watch, her trembling hands searched the desk. In a locked drawer, which Eli pried open with his knife, she found it, a thick leather-bound ledger. She opened it. Inside, in Croft's meticulous handwriting, was the entire sordid history of his enterprise. There were names, dozens of them, young women from all over the country. Beside each name was a date of arrival, a fabricated debt, and a cruel accounting of every drink they had served, every dance they had performed, all logged against a balance that never shrank. It was a meticulous record of human bondage. Tucked inside the back cover were a half-dozen blank, pre-signed contracts, authenticated with Mayor Hargrove's official seal. It was the weapon they needed. They took the ledger and slipped away into the darkness, the truth heavy in the satchel on Eli's shoulder. They did not ride into Bisbee as fugitives in the dead of night. They rode in the next day at high noon, when the sun was at its zenith, banishing all shadows. They rode down the center of Brewery Gulch, their heads held high. Eli was a grim, determined figure, his face set like granite. Beside him rode Clara. She wore the simple gray wool dress, her dark honey hair tied back, her face scrubbed clean of any powder or paint. She was not the dancer from the gilded cage. She was Clara, the preacher's daughter from Missouri, and she had come to reclaim her name. Heads turned as they passed. Men stopped in the street, their mouths agape. Whispers followed them like a rising wind. They saw a wanted murderer and his stolen woman, riding calmly into the lion's den. It was an act of such audacious defiance that the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Their destination was the Grand Hotel, where the town's business was conducted over whiskey and cigars. They knew that Mayor Hargrove held an informal town council meeting there every Tuesday. They dismounted, and Eli handed the reins to a stunned stable boy. He looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze and nodded, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve a hot fire in her heart. She would see this through. Eli pushed open the hotel doors and strode into the lobby. About a dozen men were gathered there, Mayor Hargrove, several prominent mine owners, and Silas Croft himself, who was holding court by the bar. At the edge of the room, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was Sheriff Miller. The conversation died as they entered, every eye fixed on them. Mayor Hargrove, a portly man with a florid face, was the first to recover. "Monroe," he blustered, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his belt. "You have a hell of a nerve showing your face here. You're under arrest." "I'm not here to be arrested," Eli said, his voice calm and clear, ringing with an authority that commanded the room. He walked to the center of the lobby, Clara at his side, and dropped the heavy satchel onto a polished table. "I'm here to see that you are—" He opened the satchel and pulled out the ledger. He opened it and laid it flat, its pages of damning evidence exposed to the light. "This is Silas Croft's account book," Eli announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But it doesn't track whiskey or poker winnings. It tracks the lives of women. Women he has lured to this town and trapped in debt, bound by these fraudulent contracts, authenticated by your mayor." He tossed one of the pre-signed contracts onto the table beside the ledger. Hargrove's face went white. "These are lies," Croft snarled, his composure cracking. "He's a desperate fugitive, a killer." Eli ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men. "I have the names of 27 women currently held in this town against their will. I have the records of their so-called debts. I have the name of a 17-year-old girl named Martha who died of neglect in one of his cabins 2 weeks ago. A girl I buried with my own hands because you all looked the other way." A murmur went through the room. The mine owners, men who were not directly involved but had long benefited from the town's corrupt ecosystem, began to shift uncomfortably. "This ends today," Eli continued, his voice low and hard. "You will release every one of these women from their contracts. You will give them passage to wherever they want to go. And you, Hargrove, will resign as mayor. If these demands are not met by sundown, a copy of this ledger and a full sworn statement will be on its way to the territorial marshal in Prescott. We can let a federal court sort out who the real criminals are in Bisbee." The room was utterly silent. The balance of power had shifted. Eli had them trapped. Silas Croft, seeing his empire of filth and money crumbling before his eyes, saw only one way out. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. He was not a man to be undone by a drifter and a used woman. With a guttural roar, he drew his pistol. "You son of a—" He never finished the sentence. Before Croft could even bring his gun to bear on Eli, another shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. It was not from Eli's gun. Croft's eyes went wide with shock. A red stain blossomed on the front of his white shirt. He looked down, a look of profound surprise on his face, and then he crumpled to the floor. Everyone turned to the source of the shot. Sheriff Miller stood by the wall, his own pistol smoking in his hand. His face was pale, his expression grim, but his hand was steady. He had finally chosen a side. "He was drawing on an unarmed man," the sheriff said, his voice flat and final, though everyone in the room knew it was a lie. Eli was armed, but it was a lie they would all have to live with now. It was the official story. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Men shouted, chairs were overturned. Mayor Hargrove, his face the color of ash, simply stared at Croft's body, his political career lying dead on the floor beside it. In the confusion, Eli grabbed Clara's hand. "Now," he said. He pulled her toward the door. Sheriff Miller watched them go, his face impassive. He made no move to stop them. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The sheriff had not done it for Eli. He had done it for his town, for his daughter, for his own tarnished soul. Eli and Clara burst out into the sunlight and ran to their horses. They mounted and galloped out of town, not looking back. They rode hard, leaving the dust and corruption of Bisbee behind them forever. They did not know what the future held, but for the first time, they were not fleeing from the past. They were riding toward a future, together, and this time, they rode with hope. Months passed. The harsh, red rock landscape of Arizona gave way to the rolling, pinon-covered hills of northern New Mexico. They found a small, abandoned homestead nestled in a valley by a clear-running stream, a place that felt 1,000 miles from the ugliness they had left behind. The seasons turned, the heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden light of autumn. They worked from sunup to sundown, building a life with their own 4 hands. They repaired the small, crumbling adobe cabin, patching the roof and plastering the walls with fresh mud and straw. Eli, who had built a life once before, found a quiet joy in the simple, honest labor. He taught Clara how to hunt, how to track, how to read the land. She, in turn, brought a gentle, stubborn life to the homestead. She planted a garden, and this time, the seeds took root, producing a small but determined crop of squash, beans, and corn. She learned the names of the wildflowers that grew by the stream and would pick them to put in a tin can on their small, handmade table. One warm afternoon, as Eli was splitting firewood, he looked up to see her in the small meadow behind the cabin. She was barefoot, her plain dress swirling around her ankles, and she was dancing. There was no music but the sound of the wind in the pines. Her eyes were closed, a serene smile on her face. She was not performing. She was not a prize. She was simply, purely, joyfully free. He watched, his heart aching with a love so deep and quiet it left him breathless. One day, a traveling mail rider, a rare visitor in their remote valley, brought them a letter. It bore the official seal of the governor of the New Mexico territory. Eli's hands were not entirely steady as he broke the seal. He read it aloud, his voice low with disbelief. The news from Bisbee, of the collapse of the trafficking ring and the mayor's resignation, had made its way to the capital. The territorial marshal had investigated and confirmed the story. The letter was a general pardon for one Eli Monroe, clearing him of all outstanding charges in connection with the events in Arizona, citing his services rendered to the cause of justice. He was a free man, truly free. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, they sat on the porch of their small cabin. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Eli was uncharacteristically silent. He had been working on something for weeks, in secret, carving it in the evenings by the firelight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. He had carved it from a piece of juniper wood that grew by the stream. It was not perfectly round, and the surface was not perfectly smooth, but it was filled with more care and intention than any diamond. He held it out to her. He had no pretty words, no practiced speech. He was not that kind of man. He simply held out the ring, his heart in his hand. Clara looked from the ring to his face, at his earnest, hopeful eyes, and a laugh, bright and clear as a river stone, escaped her lips. It was a laugh mixed with tears, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. She did not need a question. She did not need a promise. It was all there, in his eyes, in the simple, handmade ring. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Eli, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, the final scene of their old life, and the first of their new one. Came a few weeks later. The first snow of winter had dusted the high peaks, and the air was sharp with cold. They had built a fire in the hearth, and its warm, golden light filled the small cabin, pushing back the shadows. Eli sat in a chair, watching her. Clara stood by the fire, humming a nameless tune, and she began to dance. It was a slow, graceful dance, a dance of contentment, of peace. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating her smile. She was no longer the beautiful, empty-eyed creature on a stage. She was his wife, in their home, and her beauty was no longer a curse, but a gift he was privileged to witness. She twirled, her shadow dancing with her on the walls. Then she stopped and walked toward him, her eyes shining with a love that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. She knelt before his chair and took his hand, her wooden ring warm against his skin. She leaned in close and whispered, her words a soft, final promise that closed the circle of their long journey. "You're allowed to watch now," she said, her smile full of a lifetime of meaning. "Because I'm already yours." Thank you for listening to our story, and we encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.